All right, well, today is May 29th,
Yeah.
2018, and we are in the home of Rabbi Efraim Eisen.
Correct.
And I'm going to just put this right down here.
All right.
So my first question is, as I said, I'm curious about the stories of rabbis in this particular area. So can you tell the story of how you ended up being a rabbi in Western Massachusetts? How did you get here? What was that story?
How I got here. Initially, Rosalie and I, my wife, she and I were doing something called the Bashert workshop, and it was we founded it on the West Coast, and it was designed for soulmates to meet each other. And after doing that for a number of years on the West Coast, we came to Efraim, the R&D Center for Jewish, progressive Jewish thought, and it was in upstate New York. And I had once we came east, I got a job at Vassar College as the rabbi at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie. And we were there for a while, and then Rosalie, with our 6-year-old son, I believe, moved. She decided that Northampton was the place to be, because it had just set up the Jewish day school in Northampton, and so we wanted to have our kid in a fully functional Jewish day school, and that one looked good because it was progressive, and there were only 6 people in it at the time, and so we got in at the ground floor. I don't know if you've seen it.
I was visited last week.
Oh, you were there last week?
Because I might put my daughter there, and I was thinking of possibly working there.
That's a great spot. At least, anyway, it brought us to this area. And I kept the job at Vassar, so I would drive to Poughkeepsie 2 days a week and then come back. Well, that wasn't going to sustain itself very long. So then I was hired at Mount Holyoke. And at Mount Holyoke, so that was in the turn of the century, or the turn of the 100 years. Yeah, that's a century. But it was, so in 2000, in fact, I was there for the 9/11 thing. I was the rabbi at Mount Holyoke during that time period, and I stayed there for a little bit, and then Temple Israel in Greenfield was in need of a rabbi, so they called me up and they said, we need a rabbi. Turned out to be Passover 2002. And so I came, and I said, okay, I'll be the rabbi of Greenfield. So I was the rabbi of Greenfield. That's where I bar mitzvahed both your kids, right?
Yes, you sure did.
Yeah. And I quite liked it in Greenfield. I did. I was very happy there. I thought it was a good fit for me. And I enjoyed the community. So that's how I got to the area. I picked up that gig, and I was there till the very beginning of 2015. And
Could you tell, partly for the purposes of the interview and also just to fill me in, what have you been doing since 2015? Because I know you've been affiliated with, I think, Westfield State or something.
Yeah, that's right. So what's a rabbi to do in an area that's filled with rabbis? It's so I was doing basically a synagogue without walls, and people would meet in my house. They'd meet at the pond. We'd do all kinds of different things. but I needed a way to monetize it. There was no way to support myself on that kind of situation. So I picked up a job at Westfield State College. And at Westfield State College, they have an interfaith sanctuary there that is on the campus, but not of the campus. In other words, it's founded by the Westfield Foundation, and it's a home for interfaith worship. And so I've been working there since 2015, and then I picked up a job at Springfield College, being the rabbi there. And just like last week, I did a bar mitzvah up in Deerfield, right next to Ken and Jane's place. A kid that I do about 8 or 10 bar mitzvahs a year. Mm-hmm. And kids work with me privately, and I get to imbue my sense of Judaism to them. And so that's sort of what I'm doing now.
So could you talk a little bit about, based on your experience in this area, what would you say makes being a rabbi in Western Massachusetts a unique experience, and as it might compare, I don't know, to other communities that you've lived in the past or been affiliated with?
Well, there's a lot of Jews per capita here. There's a lot of Jewish people in the area. At my son's bar mitzvah, I think we counted 20 rabbis at my son's bar mitzvah in Greenfield. So there's a lot of Jewish people, and there are very few, traditional Jews. Mostly everybody around here is some degree of, I'm going to do it my way kind of thing, which is part of being Jewish anyway, but I think it's particularly endemic to this area. Mm-hmm. That there's a lot of people here who sort of do their own thing. And so I think that's probably the area. There's very few people telling me what I should do or how I should do or anything like that. And Temple Israel Greenfield was more traditional than this Westfield thing, where they don't know really much about anything. So every time I do a service, it's sort of a learning service because people don't really know much about what's going on there. And so I think that's the major quality, is that it's a pick and choose Judaism.
Mm-hmm. Would you associate any particular challenge? I mean, in some ways that sounds like that's wide open for improvisation and all kinds of wonderful creative possibilities. I imagine there might be challenges as well.
Well, there were when I was at Temple Israel in Greenfield, because there were different factions. We want more feminist, we want more environmental, we want more of this. And in Westfield, they don't know from anything. Uh-huh. They're just happy that there's a regular weekly service. Yeah. And the thing that I like about the Westfield community is that there's only like 25 families that support that community. Uh-huh. But at least half of them show up to everything.
Yeah. Which
is unusual, because I mostly get minions, which is the big thing. You're trying to get at least the basic quorum for running a service.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So I get that in Westfield most of the time. Yeah.
I know from experience, because I remember going to at least one meeting with you. There was in Greenfield, there was a clergy, sort of interfaith clergy group, and I wondered if you could talk about not specifically that group, but just your experiences as a member of the clergy in a community like Greenfield or wherever else you've been, interacting with people of other, presumably mostly Christian faiths. What's that experience been like?
I'll bring home a personal story to your family. It was Christmas Day, and I don't know if you remember the story.
I think I know where you're going with this one. Yeah, go ahead.
And it was Shabbos. So what am I going to do for Shabbos on Christmas? I decided that my sermon is going to be the Sermon on the Mount. And so I give over half a dozen lines from the Sermon on the Mount before I am quieted by members of the congregation who are trying to get away from Christmas. And they start basically telling me, we didn't come here to listen to Christian stuff. I said, so then one person got up and then another, and then finally your wife gets up. And she says, I love coming to a synagogue where I can go, and I mean, I'm not Jewish, and my husband's Jewish, and she went into her whole little rap. And she just said, I feel very comfortable knowing that my teacher, Jesus, can be spoken about openly in this shul. And that was one of the interesting moments of my rabbinate, where I realized that, that's, it's a good thing to let the people speak about what their experience is, because, there are a lot of very charged feelings about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about more specific, like your interactions with, like, wasn't there some collaboration in Greenfield between this church and that church?
Well, there was a little bit, but that's a couple of years ago now.
Uh-huh.
It's a big deal for me. My interfaith my interfaith mission has been developed in this interfaith chapel. For example, in the shul, which it's a beautiful little space. There's no pews in the middle of the room. So I first arrived there, and I saw that there was no space in the middle of the room. That there was completely open space, and so I asked somebody. I said, "Why is there open space in the middle of the room?" And the reason was because we share it with the Muslims, and they want to put out their prayer rugs and do all that stuff in the middle of the space. So I thought that was really cool. So I didn't have to redo the space every week. I just acknowledged the fact that the Muslims did it like that. And there are three of us there. There's an imam and the priest. Actually, there's many Christian ministers there, but there's the Catholic priest, there's the imam, and me. And we're all about the same body size, except they're black as night, both of them, and the three of us. And we're sort of like the Three Musketeers. We just really, we have a very warm feeling toward each other. And so it's, I find sometimes my closest compatriots are people who really are into God under a different rubric.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of, so that's pretty much it. In the Greenfield area, it was mostly meetings and this fundraiser for that, and what are we going to do for this political movement, and as you probably know, and interestingly, in Greenfield, the evangelicals were not members of our group, because if their way was the only way, they didn't want to be rubbing shoulders with us. Mm-hmm. And so they didn't. And so we didn't reach out to them.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and go back in time. My question on paper is, I want to know who you talk to, where do you go for your own spiritual edification and so on. away from beyond the paper, I guess I want to hear more about your background and how you became a rabbi and who you studied with and who influences your thinking about Judaism.
Well, it's interesting you should mention that. The International Jewish Renewal Gathering is taking place next month at University of Massachusetts. There'll be over 500 people up there studying and teaching and giving over our particular brand of Judaism. And I have one or two rabbis in that group, maybe one or two dozen, I don't know. It's who I long for more. I'd like to be around more, like to hear them more. When I was in junior high school and you had to do a career paper, I did a career report on being a rabbi. So I knew early on that I had some calling in this area. When I was a child, I would lead services, and I like to sing, and so I sing, as all the rabbis do around here. Everybody sings who's a rabbi. And so I started getting a little bit more serious as I got older, and I started studying a little bit more, and then I'm not exactly sure what happened, but I stayed involved with organized Judaism to some extent, working with children and working in the synagogue from where I came from. And when I went away to college, I had very little to do with religion or Judaism or anything like that. And let's see.
No, I'm sorry, where did you grow up?
Long Island.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Grew up on Long Island, and then I stayed on the East Coast for a few months after I graduated from Cornell, and then I hit the West Coast, and I realized I belong on the West Coast. So I moved out to the West Coast, and Jewishly, I met a young rabbi who had a great effect on me. He was a wonderful musician. He was charismatic. He had a large following of people in this small town in Ashland, Oregon.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And
One of my favorite towns.
one of my favorite towns too.
Yeah.
And I haven't been there in so many years now.
I was there about 3 months ago, actually.
Yeah, what were you doing there?
Well, Janice and I were traveling up the West Coast. We were visiting Lang.
He's in Portland?
He's in Portland, yeah. And we'll talk about that later. But anyway, that's what we were.
And then there was one rabbi who really affected me, Reb Shlomo Karbach up there. My mother, God may her memory be for a blessing, was the president of Long Island Hadassah. So she was in charge of doing all the things that Hadassah women do. And she was in charge of bringing talent to their large gatherings. And Shlomo was often one of her key people that she would bring to gatherings. And when I was 10 or 11, Shlomo and I took a liking to each other. And I went, wow, this guy is so different from my rabbi. He sings, tells stories, he's on fire. It was quite clear that he was on fire, and that my rabbi was dead. dead. So Reb Shlomo lit up thousands of young Jews all over the world. And I don't think I ever really got to frame this in my mind, but when he died in 94, I felt like it was my job to extend myself a little bit more in his direction and to continue to reach out. I got a little better on the guitar, and a lot of his melodies became my melodies. I started writing my own melodies. I could never tell a story as well as he could, but his stories were transformative. His stories would go on for 15, 20 minutes, a half hour. It would start here, it would end there, and yet he managed to keep it all together. He was an amazing storyteller. And there, on his right, is Reb Zalman, Shachter Shalomi, and together they fashioned a progressive Jewish movement for America, for the world, actually. And Shlomo was more traditional, and Zalman was more esoteric. And together they formatted a whole new way of going into Judaism. And so I think it was about when was it? It's like 205 or 206, 2005. I started studying with Zalman and his Aleph organization, and I started studying to become a rabbi. I was working as a psychotherapist for many years before that, and I found that the mixture of doing psychotherapy and doing rabbinic work was a nice blend. Although almost all my psychotherapeutic clients were not Jewish, it didn't make much difference. And then, after doing therapy for quite a number of years, in this little town called Wairika, California.
I know that town too.
Yeah. I was the first private therapist in that town. That town was like way back. And so I was the therapist there, and then I met Rosalie at Reb Zalman's Kala, which is very similar to what's happening. It was in 2001 I met Rosalie in Bryn Mawr, and then we developed Bashert, and we started doing that together. Rosalie was living in Eugene. I was living in Ashland. We got together. And then Jonathan was born. So when Jonathan was born, I had my business in Wairika, California, my therapy business, and all of a sudden she said, "Oh, we need a Hillel director at University of Oregon." So I went up to the University of Oregon and I became their Hillel director. And then from that point on, our Bashert workshop started to really take off. Rosalie and I started getting into a groove, and we did workshops. We did over 200 workshops throughout our time together. And over 10,000 people actually showed up at our workshops over all those years. So we did a lot to disseminate a new level of Jewish reality to our generation, because anyway, that's what we did. Mm-hmm. And we did workshops in Israel, we did workshops in Canada, we did workshops on the West Coast, the East Coast, and then finally we decided, let's hit the East Coast, and that was in like 98, 99, and I haven't never really been back since. Not for extended periods of time. So that's sort of that story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it's nice that I have those guys up there because those guys were my resting place. We used to call them the last of the Mohegans. They were the last of the European Jewish educated people who came to the United States and tried to bring their brand of Judaism to America.
Mm-hmm.
And Reb Shlomo, God bless him, may his memory be for a blessing always. He was traveling all the time. He took it as his life's work to bring his light and his insight to hundreds of thousands, but thousands of people anyway. And he was quite a light, and he's greatly missed by many of us, and not so much missed by others of us. But that's a whole other story.
Yeah, Mark, while you were, just before we started, Mark had noticed that picture.
Yeah, that picture behind it is also from Reb Shlomo's Moshav, which is a Jewish settlement in Israel.
Oh.
And that is a picture of a messianic coming to the Holy Temple.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah. And that picture behind you is the picture of Avraham traveling around traveling the desert looking for his people.
Well, that's a good segue, because speaking of the Holy Land, I wanted to ask you about how over the years, and particularly as a rabbi, how the subject of Israel what impact has that had, and how have you dealt with the topic of Israel among your congregants and in general in the communities that you've been part of here in Massachusetts?
Well, I had spent a lot of time in Israel. In fact, I had a little apartment in Israel for some time. And when I was in my early 20s, I spent some time in Israel, and it had a great effect on me. And I became a strong Zionist. And I noticed as I would speak about my feelings about Israel, I would often alienate many of my congregants because people were, what about the Palestinians, and all that stuff. And so I started talking and acting less on the Israel front because I found it very divisive. If I would talk about Israel, people would get very upset. And I just, anyway, that was my experience about Israel. I've always had a strong love for Israel. When I met the guys, the Combatants for Peace, have you met those guys?
Almost. we went to an event a few weeks ago and had to leave before they actually made their spiel. I saw the film about them. But.
Yeah, well, those guys tempered my heart quite a bit. When I heard about how they wanted to kill each other, and then they realized that was not the way. And I've been to major peace events in Israel. The Sulha, which is an Arab word for, I think means ingathering. And so that was very powerful when I went to the Sulha. And then I brought Temple Israel.
I remember.
To Israel in 2007. And 42 people came on that trip. give a little plug to Harold Grinspoon for that, because he helped pay for that. And I'm sure you've heard the name before. And interestingly enough, my orientation was very spiritual. I wanted to go and pray and go to these different spots. And I noticed that the congregation was much more into the politics of the wall. The wall had just gotten built to separate the Palestinians from the Israelis, and most of the people on the trip were much more oriented to that wall. So that's a whole other story. I said to everybody, I'm going to the wall on Shabbos. Anybody who wants to join me, please come join me. So that was Rhonda came with me, and Riva came with me, and one or two other people came with me. But most of the people wanted to see the other wall. And I never quite got on that wavelength. I'm just sort of a dyed-in-the-wool Zionist. I'll die a Zionist. I lived a Zionist. I don't have much tolerance for the poor Palestinians. The poor Palestinians, and I don't really talk about it much because then I get labeled a right-wing extremist, and I'm not a right-wing extremist. But I also am. That's the home team. That's the way I feel about it. It's the home team, and you might have some problems with the home team, but when pitch comes to shove, that is your home team, and you don't turn on your home team. At least that's my basic thing, and I don't ever talk about that publicly because people get alienated, and it's one of the reasons I'm not at Temple Israel any longer, because it really was much more divisive than people wanted.
Yeah. Well, I could tell you some more about some recent observations I've had on that subject.
Mm-hmm.
I could reflect on a recent experience I had. Anyway, Mark, did you have any questions you want to jump in on?
So, Reb Shlomo and Reb Zalman, they spearheaded this renewal Judaism that was like a grassroots movement in contrast to the dead rabbis and dead congregations. So how did that type of Judaism play when you were a congregational rabbi in Greenfield? How did it translate into that more conservative setting of that synagogue that you were in charge of?
So there's an interesting story about that. When I first got there, I brought my guitar, and the head of the spiritual committee said, no musical instruments on Shabbos. I said, no musical instruments on Shabbos. I said, how? It's like taking out my legs. No musical instruments on Shabbos. So he says, well, if you decide to play music, I'm quitting. I said, you're shitting me. He says, no, I'm not. If you start playing, I'm going to leave the congregation. Now you can't find a congregation that doesn't have music. But that was 15 years ago, right? So, the times they have changed. And so then a year or two later, one of my congregants said, hey, I'd like you to play music at my daughter's bat mitzvah. I said, nothing would give me greater pleasure than playing at your daughter's bat mitzvah. However, there is one glitch. And this is where my answer to your question comes. I said, but you're going to have to go to my spiritual practices committee and advocate for that, because I have a strong opponent to that perspective. I sat in on that meeting. Took exactly 30 seconds. Now, it was a year and a half later or something, but everything had changed. Oh, of course, you want to play, if you want to do that, then of course you can do it. So that was my foot into doing Judaism the way I like to do Judaism, which is musical, like, bordering on the ecstatic if I can ever get that high. And like I say, now you saw the JCA, everybody's dancing, everybody's singing, everybody's doing the kind of Judaism that I brought to Greenfield, many years ago. And so now I'm a happy member of the JCA, and I love Ben Weiner, the rabbi there, which, as a rabbi, it's a little hard to swallow your pride and go into places where you lost your job. Even though that wasn't the spot where I lost my job. So, and then, like this bar mitzvah and the 8 or 10 that I do every year are completely the way I want to do them. There's no spiritual practices committee that I have to answer to. There's nobody I have to answer to. This is pretty much the basic. This is a junior kind of. It's like a junior congregation service, but it's got most of the elements of a full Jewish service in it. Most of the kids that come to me have no Hebrew, and within a year, their parents want them to be able to do Haftorah, Torah, lead the services, and do all that stuff. So it's a fairly intensive training program once a week, and the kids have to do some homework and take care of all that. So it's a balancing act for me, because some kids can really do it and other kids can't. But since I'm the arbiter of what can and can't be done, I can pretty much set the standards that need to be met. That's a good question, though.
Just one tag part. Did that guy ever quit? Who threatened?
I think he had his own personal wrestling match with God. And I do believe he did quit, but I don't think it had anything to do with me or what I was doing. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't.
Well, I just assume not mention it. Yeah.
I have one last question, which is, what's for you? This is like the big question. What's the most important legacy of Judaism for you, and what do you tell people if they ask you what Judaism means to you?
Usually say something like Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, serve God with joy. And I'm big into the joy rather than the oi of Judaism. And and no matter what religious tradition you come from, a good melody is a good melody, and if you like to move, you can move. And so it's about serving the Holy One with joy. And that would be about it for me. Whether it's tikkun olam, cleaning up the environment, doing your private or public spiritual practice, serve God with joy.
Well, that's a nice note on which to end.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.